The historic preservation section of the Planning and Development Department has actually been involved in cemetery work since 1992, and we were part of the Moncrief Road Cemetery Citizens Committee. However, it was the comprehensive plan that really laid the foundation for us to expand the program related to cemeteries. Particularly objective number 1.2, which says to identify, document, record, and evaluate the historic resources within the city of Jacksonville. And of course, cemeteries are part of those historic resources. Because of this particular element of the comprehensive plan and the previous work we had done with the Moncrief Road Cemetery project, we began to set up files for cemeteries. And as we got documentation in about a cemetery, would it be a newspaper article, would it be a listing of burials, whatever, we put it in that file. And a lot of our information came from genealogists. They were very, very generous in sharing information. As they found it, they would share it with us. Matter of fact, one guy, I'm going to mention his name because he's passed away, but he should be always acknowledged. A guy named John Ferguson went out with his cohort in crime, Mike Lawton, and he documented 82 cemeteries in Duval County, black, white, and he put a composite together of over 17,000 burials, which we have that in our archives as well. Consistent with the comp plan, we also received a grant to have an archaeological plan developed for Duval County. And the biggest part of that was developing an archaeological sensitivity map, that is to develop certain parameters that would identify sites as having high, medium, and low probability of being present based upon certain criteria. As part of that plan, we also had the consultant document all known cemeteries in Duval County, and in doing that was to put them list them all on the Florida Master Site File, or have a Florida Master Site File filled out for each one of them. The consultants identified about 105 cemeteries in Duval County that was recorded. And then what we did is the information that was received from this survey was put on our GIS layers, both the probability map as well as the location of these cemeteries, so we can use that information in a development review process to ensure that construction is not approved that will impact a historic cemetery. The 105 cemeteries that was documented, they vary from a single isolated burial to the Mammoth Evergreen Cemetery, which had hundreds of thousands of graves, which were, of course, not listed by any chance. The historic preservation element of the City of Jacksonville, Chapter 307-104, allows the City Council to approve the landmark designation of cemeteries. We have listed about 12 cemeteries as landmark sites. Generally, that was initiated by the property owner or some responsible party for the cemetery in which they seek this designation. If it is a local landmark, our review process is only related to public spaces, things like trails, fences, walls, and so forth. We do not get involved in the selections of monuments. We do not get involved in interment. We do not get involved in reinterment, anything of that nature. The City of Jacksonville, we kept getting complaints about the condition of cemeteries, and they created a blue ribbon committee. It was well represented. The committee was to address abandoned and neglected cemeteries. They had representatives including funeral directors, cemetery managers, a lawyer, representatives of history and genealogical organizations, and so forth. And of course, they came up with, they identified the problems and then came up with the resolutions or possible resolutions to those problems, and that was provided to the city council. One of the things that was done on that process, one of the recommendations was to have our department sort of be the, I don't know, the center part of the city of Jacksonville for cemetery-related issues. And because we had all the information, and that we did, but now actual helping people locate burials is now handled by the special collection of the Florida Genealogy section of the public library. Now, I want to talk about this. I'm going to talk about this particular case that came up in February of 2010. A construction company was digging up field dirt off the site that was located what's called East Port Road, sorry. And when they took the dirt over to a construction site and began to spread it out, they began to find human remains. They found a tombstone. They found pieces of metal that probably reflected a casket. Sorry, I keep getting away from the microphone. I know. Me and microphones just don't seem to work. I'd rather scream than use one of these things. The police were first called. They began to search out to see if there were other human remains and so forth. They contact, as required by law, they contact the state medical examiner. They came out and determined that the bones were not of recent origin, and forward this information on to the state archaeologists, and they got involved. And right now, these human remains are located at a forensic laboratory at Florida Gulf Coast University. I think it's in Fort Myers. Why did this happen? Why do we not know the cemetery was here? Of course, that's a problem. It was recorded. It was recorded in the WPA Veterans listing, and it was identified as the East Point Cemetery, colored cemetery. But that information has never got to our level. And to give you the difficulty of the WPA in describing the location of these cemeteries, like East Port Cemetery was identified as turning left on a shell road, going through the old mill quarters, go beyond about 200 yards, turn right, and go into the road from another road, running north and south, and go for another quarter of a mile to the cemetery itself. So it's sometimes very difficult to follow these descriptions of exactly where they're located. But what we did find out in doing research, not only did we find out about the WPA Veterans Grave Registration, we also got a USGS 1918 topographic map, and on that map it showed what's probably a sawmill or maybe a turpentine mill, and near there are worker houses, little squares that represent workers' houses. We believe that the cemetery might be associated with this operation. Many times these large sawmills had not only worker houses, but they had cemeteries for their workers as well, family members. And we think it might have come from that. There's also a community called Polytown nearby that might also have been the source of the burials. The thing is that this is an ever-going process. In my office right now, we have potentially records on about 30 additional cemeteries that have never been documented. And many times this is based on oral history where somebody just says, I remember there was a cemetery there, or I think the cemetery was 2 blocks down that way. We have also had people do obituary research, and many times they will find a listing of a burial in a cemetery that we don't even know about. It could be a cemetery we do know about, just under a different name, but that occurs as well. So our work is never ending. We continue to go forward, and we'll continue to identify cemeteries, and we'll continue to record cemeteries as best we can, and go from there. Thank you very much.
So Patricia with Terracon is going to talk a little bit about the conservation work. And the city of Jacksonville appropriated about $10 million for improvements to predominantly African-American cemeteries across the city, I believe in 2018. Was that appropriated? So Patricia's going to go over some of that work.
Thank you. I will try really hard to talk into this as well because I seem to be a little soft-spoken some days. So before we started, Joel handed me the report, the Blue Ribbon report, and we were talking about the quote that's on the front of this. And I do want to take a second to read it. And I know you guys are going to nudge me on the time. I do tend to go over on my time as well. So, but this is really good. Show me the manner in which a nation or a community cares for its dead. I will measure exactly the sympathies of its people, their respect for the laws of the land, and their loyalty to high ideals. By William Gladstone. And I think what's really important about this is that we don't always remember that we should show respect to those who have gone before us. And the way that, sometimes we really can do that is to protect our cemeteries and preserve them as the best we can. So I've known Joel for a while. I moved here in 2014, and I think I met him that same year, and immediately we were told about these cemeteries. I think I mentioned I'm an architectural conservator by trade, a preservationist for a really long time, and what we had found out is that the city of Jacksonville, even though they had performed a study in the 90s to identify and locate and map the cemeteries that were in Duval County, that information was a bit old, and so they wanted to not only update that information, and they had an archaeological modeling map made, a predictability model made, which also helped with that information. But they also had these cemeteries that needed just a lot of work. And it actually started with a council member, Denise Lee, who unfortunately recently left us. She passed. But she started by, an earmark of funds to do a study to see what we needed to do for the cemeteries. What could we do to actually preserve them? And that money was helped fund a small conditions assessment that then actually really snowballed into what became the $10 million that was appropriated in capital improvement money for the rest of the work to happen. So there again, as they mentioned, the case study that we have is there were 5 cemeteries, actually 6, I guess, but many of them African American cemeteries up on the northwest side of Jacksonville in an area called Moncrief. One of those cemeteries is for our indigent dead. And then we also have Old City Cemetery, which is downtown. The other remaining cemeteries were used primarily for the segregated African American community, and a lot of them had just unfortunately fell into disrepair. They were owned and operated by a company that was no longer in existence. So the Moncrief Cemeteries Association and the Afro-American Life Insurance Company had gone, they were defunct. They were no longer in existence. A lot of times with properties, a community will take ownership of that property and then you'll turn around and sell it because you can make money. Unfortunately, with cemeteries that are full, no one really wants to buy that property. So maintenance of those properties fell back on the city of Jacksonville. Now, technically by law, they didn't have to do that, but they did take on those responsibilities of maintaining the cemeteries. However, it's over 60,000 acres. Maintenance actually falls not within Parks and Rec, but actually under mowing and landscape. And so there's a lot of different factors here that were put into play for people to really understand how to take care of these and who actually owned these cemeteries and whose responsibility it was for these actions to happen. And so you'll see a little bit on the screen some of the information, that we started with. I'm going to take my notes now and cheat a little bit here. but we all know that knowledge is power. And so when we started with the information that we had, we found that a lot of that information was actually out of date. So we endeavored on a conditions assessment, but one of the things we wanted to make sure was that information was not lost again, or that we would be able to use it in the future. So GIS was really important for us to use to make sure we married all of the data that we had, so that kind of would live in perpetuity and we could update it periodically. So we started with the conditions assessment by identifying all of the features, looking at the condition, the vegetation, the markers, the burials themselves, the architectural features, the fencing, the gates, the pathways, and all of that information. All of that information was mapped. And we had to bring in a lot of experts, subject matter experts to help us with those. So when it came to trees, we brought in an arborist to get a health assessment of those trees. We do have archaeologists on our staff, and we worked with them to help with identification of burials. I'll tell you first and foremost, I am not an archaeologist. I love them, but I am a preservationist. I do everything above ground, and I rely on my friends that are archaeologists to do everything below ground. So our focus is everything above ground. We're looking at creating an inventory, basically, of things. So we had wetland scientists that came in and delineated our wetlands or low-lying areas that would essentially collect water that we needed to be mindful of. Again, the arborists that we used. We did look back at Mr. Ferguson's information that Joel had mentioned earlier, John Ferguson, the genealogist that had done all of this research. So we collected that information. And then our conservators came in and did the inventory and a conditions assessment of all of the markers themselves. And then we basically marry all of that together, and you come up with some pretty fun visuals, but at the same time, it's a really big, thick database that you can export and use. So one of the things I do want to highlight is with the cemeteries, when we were working up in the northwest side of Jacksonville, a lot of them had been, because they had not been maintained for a long time, had really been overgrown. And when I say overgrown, I mean you can't walk 6 to 12 inches in front of you without being in brush. I'm 5 foot tall, and a lot of these were over my height. So there were not only mature trees that had developed over the past 40 years, but also brush, saw palmetto, lots of vines and things like that. So just to even get in and do the condition on the actual markers or monuments themselves, we had to do a lot of brush clearing. And I like this visual. I think the one on the left is about halfway cleared. The one on the right, you can see, is actually we have completely cleared all of the underbrush from the cemetery. So we'll talk a little more specifically now about just a couple of the cemeteries that we worked in. Old City Cemetery is downtown. It actually is a city-owned property, and so the maintenance of that property had been ongoing, and there was a lot of information that had already been collected, but the markers or monuments themselves, unfortunately, needed a lot of work. I'm going, okay, I need to speed it up. So we had a, so this, just so you know, this cemetery in particular is very good for like living history. There's a lot of tours there and things of that nature. And so we were using this one sort of as a role model to use when we were developing a plan for future maintenance and efforts for the African American cemeteries in Moncrief. The work that was done, of course, we did the same thing here that we did in the other cemeteries. We looked at all of the trees, and we developed a plan for conservation that we would actually go in and do the work and how to prioritize that work. And I will tell you that taking care of the trees and getting them out so that it is a safe area for you to work in is the number one thing that you need to do, because we don't want to be working in a cemetery and a tree limbs fall, and then that's just a safety hazard. So trees and vegetation, those things were always first. And then we came in and prioritized those markers. And what I like about this slide, and thanks to Stephanie for putting this here, is that it gives you a percentage and shows you approximately how many of these you have. Out of 3,000 resources, approximately 60 of them really just needed cleaning, and that's something that a volunteer group can do. Let me go back real quick. Those that have fallen, but they're stable, they're not posing a safety hazard. So that's something that volunteers can also do after they've been trained. Our friends at FPAN are very good at hosting crypt trainings and showing volunteers how to reset stones properly, how to clean them properly, what solvents to use, surfactants to use, and things like that. And so the next one that you're going to see, probably the second in from the right, is one that's leaning. That may, even though it looks pretty stable, it might take somebody that with a little bit more knowledge, because once that is actually a broken stone, and when you take it out of the ground, we have to put it back together. That's a very sophisticated process. We don't want to just use Loctite. Please don't ever do that. But so what you want to do is just really understand the level of effort that it's going to take to have somebody put those back together. And so where you can have volunteers do that work, where you're going to have a professional come in, and where you're going to have a professional with really good equipment. And that would be the one on the right-hand side, the far right. This is a really quick and easy one. This stone really just needed cleaning and remortaring or pointing to close up the gaps, and so we were able to do that. This is a little more sophisticated repairs that I was speaking about. And, one, you have to find all of the pieces, so there's a little bit of investigation there. That's where our archaeological friends come into play. Once we get everything out, being able to put that stone back together. And then, of course, having the equipment, such as a hoist or a gantry or something, to help you place the stone back. And then the picture on the right is actually the finishing work that we do to make it all nice and pretty, and then clean it. So I'm going to go back. Do I have at least 1 minute? Okay. We're going to skip over. And this is actually, one of the things you can see on the left-hand side is the image on the left shows a little bit of that overgrowth. And a lot of these, again, maintenance is one of those things, if you're a planner, if you have these cemeteries, find out who maintains them and help them come up with a plan to really keep them maintained so that you don't have the problem on the left. Because the problem on the right is a lot easier to work with if you have a conservator. The problem on the left is actually the hardest part, is really just finding everything. Again, the importance of understanding the ethnic heritage, who's buried there, what were their burial practices, what are you looking for? We don't want to disturb anything that is could show us where someone is actually buried, and that could be a planting. That could be literally as easy as a plant, a perennial that comes back every year, or a funerary offering or anything of that nature. A pipe out of the ground could also signify the soul, being released. So you just want to make sure you know what you're looking for, and I think the big thing is know your subject matter experts and when to call them in. Know when to call in an archaeologist, a genealogist, a professional conservator, and there's a lot of different places that we can help you find those folks.
Thanks. Sarah with the Florida Public Archaeology Network, or we call it FPAN, is going to talk a little more. She's a great resource.
Good afternoon. As I said in my introduction, I'm Sarah Miller from the Florida Public Archaeology Network, and I wanted to do a land acknowledgement for the unceded land of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and also recognize the Gullah Geechee, whose area we are in, from Jacksonville, Florida to Jacksonville, North Carolina, and about 30 miles inland from the Atlantic Bight. So I am also very grateful for this opportunity, and for that reason, Representative Glenda Cinnamons-Jenkins wanted me to participate today and share with you, the planners and the people we really rely on for help, just some of the things we found out in doing this work together up in Nassau County. Our session was called Sacred Sand, Contemporary Issues of Erasure of African American and Gullah Geechee Burial Grounds. We will. It will be different because we won't be in the Gullah Geechee region, but I'm sure we will travel to other areas and continue to try and diversify. I just got back from Dublin and the European meetings and was really floored to learn that the Society for African Archaeologists doesn't meet in Africa. They meet in, America, in Fort, what's the one in Texas? Fort Worth. I'm like, Fort Worth? I was expecting somewhere else. But, we need to decolonize our practice and go to those communities where they are. As mentioned a couple times, we do a program called Cemetery Resource Protection Training, and that's actually one of the first ways I connected with Rep. Jenkins and the Gullah Geechee community in our area. We go through some presentations on how to manage cemeteries. We do use Adrienne's brilliant cemetery management plan. That's a great exercise for anyone to go through. We do go over the laws, which has gotten interactive and a little more interesting, so kudos for getting those laws out there. We go through how to list sites, cemeteries on the Florida Master Site File, because data gaps do lead to erasure, and that's something we need to make sure of. These are all the dots of historic cemeteries in Florida. There's about 1,400. The Division of Cemeteries for the state estimates there are actually 8,000. And you can guess whose thousands of cemeteries are not listed on the state site file. So we have a lot of work to do, and the community really wants to help. So we teach the community how to go out and record them, but also just to go out and give monitoring. I had the chance to go to the Moncrief cemeteries before the project, and I've got to go, like today, this afternoon, I'm going to go back out, because monitoring them and seeing them as they are in the field, things change a lot in a year, and those changes can be recorded so someone can help and do something about it. Our Cemetery Resource Protection Training Group, we've done over 100 workshops in the state and a couple in surrounding states. We have over 1,600 graduates. We've involved over 30 counties, over 54 cities, and we're going to have our 5th conference this year for our cemetery. Our Crypt Alliance is going to be in, that's timed, isn't it? In Archer and in Gainesville in February. So if you're interested to learn more about that, and again, we have FPAN centers all over the state that are doing these kind of activities. I just want to show you some of the things we bumped into in our Gullah Geechee Nassau Cemetery Recording Project. Of the 70 cemeteries listed on the Florida Master Site File for Nassau County, we noticed a bit of a problem. They weren't where they said they were located. So for planners, this is really important. You have a certain amount of tools that you rely on in making informed decisions. In the first half of our project, we found only 6 of the 70 were in the right place. And now we're completed and have found more cemeteries, and only 11 of those were found in the right place. That's a big problem because some of them, there was no pattern. We're trained to look for patterns. We could see no pattern in how they were off. They were off by miles. They were off across the street. This becomes a big deal with private property, and if you're able to get on. And I can proudly say I've now gotten a cease and desist letter to say, stop recording African American cemeteries on our land, which is actually not illegal, and you don't need landowner permission. And I challenge you to get the same kind of letter back. And the sad news is the planner we were working with did get fired. So I understand that's a real scarce issue for you all and how you get involved, but that's also why I'm here today, is to tell you it has not been real easy. But having a long-term partnership, we're also looking at sea level rise, the impacts of climate change, and then again, this is probably the number one way we help local governments right now, is going to verify site location, because all the tools you have and all the modeling is only as good as where those dots are located. And our case study in Nassau County shows their way off. If you're interested in learning more about our CRIP program, I wrote up the building blocks for it in this Advances in Archaeological Practice article. I'd be happy to send to you. And we were just hoping to build a network of other cemetery stewards that could rely on each other. We have a Facebook page called Crypt Alliance. You're welcome to join and follow along, and those are our graduates that are posting questions and challenges to each other, or just, you know, September is another good time to get involved. Was mentioned that Florida has a historic cemetery inventory, which you can go online. It is a project of the state, but it is hosted at FPAN, and when the postcards come in of people wanting to report cemeteries, guess who gets those? So I could tell Chip Birdsong did some processing of postcards about a month ago, and we had 10 cemeteries in a row like, come help. So I think going out and hearing their issues on the ground. I was in Titusville at the LaGrange Cemetery. That has the settlers, the founder of the town. And we were in the African American section of LaGrange Cemetery because the founders of Titusville were African American. That part had not been recorded on the site file, so we had to add that. And come to find out, the LaGrange Church that was on the National Register of Historic Places was a couple miles away from where the real location was. So just to say some caution, and that it's worth going back and ground truthing these, because without knowing where the dots are, you can't manage what you don't know. So thank you, and excited to be here today. Thanks for inviting me.
All right, I think we only went a few minutes over. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Yes. So the questions about sea level rise and environmental conditions.
The first person who brought this to my attention was Adrienne Burke, who was working on the master plan for her cemetery, and said, hey, the cemetery is showing some impact with the 3-foot rise, the 6-foot rise. I'm like, huh. And that was about 2012. And since then, I've done just about nothing else but try and chase down, oh my God, what's going to happen to cultural resources? What's going to happen to historic cemeteries? The Atlantic coast, the sea level rate is 20% higher than the global average. So we are in a unique, stressed position. We do a lot of monitoring of archaeological sites and of cemeteries. Some of the areas we've seen are already at the 2-foot scenario. So it's not like we're waiting. They are already there with standing water year round. We have seen some cemeteries retreat and start to bury further back. And there's also a cost you may want to know of. It's something like $1,400 per burial to get removed. This was estimated by the Army Corps of Engineers, who's having to do a fair amount of relocation. So something for cities to think about. And it's not just sea level rise, the storm surge. Nassau County and Duval County have the highest storm surge levels that will endanger cemeteries. So this is, you're right at ground zero for cemeteries impacted by sea level rise, by the storm surge, and, we're lucky this last storm to dodge so much, but get out there and record them and make sure they're known about, because even in our estimates of how many resources will be hit in a 3-foot rise or 6-foot rise, it only helps if they're mapped in the right place, which many of them are not. Anyone else?
So the importance of aerial inventory. Thanks. Yes. Well, when I mentioned the reckoning, I think you see these headlines in the news. A lot of different municipalities are dealing with it and approaching it differently. And Adrienne can speak some more. I know there were projects in Tampa. The city's attempted to purchase the property and turn it into a park. Mhm. Right. Some cities are stepping up. They're trying to sometimes buy the whole land, sometimes work with descendants to relocate, at the very least, a marker. The private development issue is harder.
Yeah, the private development issue. Yeah, the city, Tampa and Clearwater have had a lot of media attention around this, so there's a lot you can look at in the news about some of the strategies that have been employed there. And it was because of those cemeteries that state legislation was ultimately created and passed after they created a state task force. There's another example of a cemetery in Miami that did that, the Lemon City Cemetery, that was part of a housing development. They've created a memorial at the site. So there's different strategies. The private development one is really tricky. As I mentioned, that statute, it's not necessarily that a private property owner can't use that land, but there is a right to access from descendants. So they can't necessarily use the land where the cemetery is. Now, that's where you get into things, though, Sarah probably has more expertise with, like, when things have to be relocated. I don't know. Ideally, you have a willing private property owner who's going to work with you. It gets tricky with the private development, I think. I don't know if you have any specific examples, Sarah.
Yeah, it's definitely worth tracking your descendants, because in Florida, descendants have a lot of rights that other people do not. So me speaking up for a cemetery is not going to be as impactful as a descendant community member. There are laws that follow for cemetery removal, and those have to get posted and followed through by the local government. But there's lots of opportunities to divert development, just shift a little bit, or even do, potentially some land swaps, although they do get moved every day in Florida. And it's interesting how different consultation process follow in working with different communities. For example, one that was near DeLand, they said, okay, you can remove our community members, but you need to get them in the ground before nightfall. And I was just speaking to an archaeologist in Kenya, and she said, yes, it's the same thing here. It's the nobody buries after, 4 o'clock, 6 o'clock here. And so you have some really interesting cultural continuity to be mindful of, and it's nice when that happens. But, in another state, Kentucky, we got involved with moving about 600 people in about 6 weeks, which is not ideal. And if we had had one descendant come forward, that might not have happened. But it did, and they're now reinterred in a respectful place, but they do often get moved.
I just want to touch on it really quickly because in the land developing process, right, you're looking at permitting from potentially sometimes, obviously, from state agencies or even federal agencies due to water management districts and things like that, but also permitting through the local government. And I think as long as there's something in place within your ordinance that actually identifies what needs to happen with those when you are surveying those lands for the potential for development, that's a proactive approach, right? We want to be proactive about it. And so during permitting for state and federal agencies, they go through the compliance, Section 106 compliance portion, which kind of gives a red flag that you have to take special care of these resources. But I would just encourage everyone on the local level to have those same actions, ordinances to have actions in place.
Dots matter. Dots matter.
I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a question? Looks like no. Do you want to mention the resource?
I know it's old school, but we did print out a resource list of some great websites, state and federal, if anyone's interested. And thanks so much for coming.